Hi, this is Dr. Bob Fitrakis, bringing you the other side of the news on WGRN 94.1, the Green Renaissance, your community radio station.
Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
I've got Jeremy Baiman, labor activist on WGRN. Any parallels here between the mass resistance of the labor union, which brought us things like the weekend and decent wages, and this current incredibly important movement for racial justice?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm happy to be here, and there are definitely parallels between the labor movement and what we're seeing right now. The most obvious parallel is that, you know, just like our working conditions, wages, and benefits in the workplace that we now take for granted, nothing was given peacefully by politicians, right, or won in elections. These are rights that were fought for on the street. In often very bloody battles. And so we are seeing, you know, I think the culmination of a long period of time where, you know, our communities of color have asked politicians nicely, have, you know, petitioned politicians, have done hearings, have run for office, and yet still face, you know, systemic, institutional, and other forms of racism. What I will say about these particular protests, though, that makes them so exciting and so different is the youth. I have to say that in the crowds that I've been in, the median age can't be more than 20. These are college and high school kids, a whole new generation who are leading this fight, and it's really inspiring.
Yeah, I had hundreds march by my house here on Broad Street downtown, and I was stunned. I mean, absolutely stunned at how young they were.
It's very inspiring.
Yeah, it's you know, as somebody who spent a decade or so at very small rallies and the Columbus establishment priding itself on there'd never really been any strong resistance and assuring themselves they must be doing something right. This is a generation that appears not to be willing to tolerate the brutality of the police and the blatant inequality of our society.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bob. And, you know, I certainly don't want to speak for a movement that is led by people of color. As a white man, you know, there are concrete demands that are out there. I would definitely encourage folks to check out the People's Justice Project set of demands. And what you see throughout this week, at least what I've observed, is the evolution of folks learning how to do this. So we have these kind of pitched street battles that are going on, but at the same time, you have an entire conversation around strategy in terms of how to escalate and how to put pressure on politicians. So what started at the State House last night ended up at Mayor Ginther's doorstep in the form of the die-in protests that you probably saw. And it's just exciting to see folks, this new generation of activists, learn and lead, you know, in a way that I haven't certainly seen in my 10 years in Columbus. I know you've been here a lot longer than me.
Well, one of the things, the Columbus way will say it's inappropriate to go to somebody's house. What do you say on that?
I say that communities of color don't get to choose when they experience police violence, and they don't get to choose where they experience police violence. So the purpose of a protest at the mayor's house is to help him understand that a large segment of our population can't feel safe anywhere, doesn't get to retreat from their workplace to their home and not have police barge in on a no-knock warrant like what happened to Breonna Taylor, you know, recently. And folks have to understand that change comes when the power structure starts to feel uncomfortable. And I think we're seeing protesters understand and experience a willingness to make the Columbus power structure uncomfortable in a way again, that's new and exciting, and certainly different from what I've experienced in my time here.
This is The Other Side of the News, streaming to you from the Indie Media Studios of the Free Press Network on YouTube, but also available online at WGRN.org. Plus, listen to us on Columbus, Ohio's 2 volunteer-run low-power FM radio stations, Friday at 5:30 p.m. on 94.1 FM, The Green Renaissance, and rebroadcasted Mondays at 4:30 p.m. on WCRS, the community radio station, both 92.7 and 98.3 FM.
And you've been at a few of the protests. I've been downtown, but mainly operating out of the Free Press office. Any other observations? I was looking the other day, and it looked like they split in 4 different directions. Instead, I was thinking, having seen them get the demonstrators be pounded the night before, this time they seem to move in different directions that confuse the police.
Yeah, there's a little bit of strategy, I think. And obviously, as I said, I haven't been involved directly in the planning, but just observationally, I've seen 2 things. I've seen the protests split in the way that you're describing. I've also seen various protests come together. So I was at a protest, I think over the weekend on Sunday, which began in Clintonville up at Broadway and High, and then by the end of the day had marched, several miles down High Street and joined the main protest at the State House.
Yeah, some interesting footage I saw was from Portsmouth, which was stunning, right? The police took a knee with they were primarily white Appalachians with a couple of minorities. They're African Americans, and they got it. You looked at their signs, you heard what they were saying. That gave me tremendous hope, for solidarity.
It's incredible. It's incredible to see, I don't know if you saw the footage from Upper Arlington yesterday. Thousands of protesters.
They would have called out the police in full riot gear. If that many, I don't think that many people have ever, maybe a sporting event, have ever gathered in Upper Arlington.
Yeah, it was incredible.
Which is a community that, explicitly, the only community that explicitly barred minorities, and not just blacks, but you got points against you back in the 60s if you were Jewish or Catholic. So I think that was a stunning rebuke of some of the past history of Upper Arlington.
Yeah, the time frame on this thing is just incredible. How fast it's grown. You've seen protests now all over the world. And I just, it's been building a long time, but it's exciting to see it, this take flame. And my big concern, as a person who has more than a decade in the labor movement, my concern is not only making sure that it's sustainable long-term, but also that groups coalesce around concrete demands. Because what you saw out of City Council this week in their meeting was yet another resolution, right? Yet another piece of meaningless fluff and then you saw the mayor sitting next to the police chief at a press conference defending their actions again. And that comes after the city council president, a county commissioner, and a U.S. congressperson were pepper sprayed, right, at a protest. So,
and I found it interesting. Ted Decker, who's hardly a radical columnist for the Columbus Dispatch, talked about how out of touch Andy Ginther was with the mayors in the northeastern urban cities. Right, they were all with, for the most part, with the resistance, with the demonstrators, and he's up there with the police chief, who's literally ranting and blaming everything on the protesters.
Yeah, there was a press release that came out of the mayor's office. I think it was this morning. It may have been yesterday. I think it was this morning, which talked about flattening the curve of racism. It was literally a phrase coming out of this press release. And it was, you want to talk about tone deaf, insulting, verbiage to conflate two current events that happen to be occurring at the same time, while, you know, not actually making any meaningful progress towards resolution. It's just stunning. It really is. For a city this large, for a power structure this entrenched, I think part of it, Bob, as you know, is they just haven't faced any real opposition in a very long time. And I'm not sure they know how to handle it.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, knowing the history and you know how most of them are there because they were appointed and towed the line when the police were so aggressive for so long, and the FOP endorsement was all these people ever really wanted. Well, let's go to your footage. You can introduce it, and we'll let Thomas Quinlan, the police chief, speak for himself. Would you like to introduce it?
Absolutely. So this video on Monday in the evening, roughly 7 o'clock, Chief Quinlan was down at the State House speaking with some protesters. Now, this was after a particularly violent night on Sunday, where you saw a lot of that footage of the tear gas, the mace, the stun grenades. And so, you know, I happened to catch him at a moment where he was talking to another officer and asked if I could ask him some questions. And he agreed. And what followed is this, you know, roughly 3-minute conversation.
Yes, the curfew's been at 10 p.m. every night.
Okay.
Yesterday, all day was peaceful, right? Until about 8:30, 9 o'clock.
Okay.
Your folks rolled in and started tear gassing folks. This is on video.
Okay.
So can you explain why you'd be tear gassing folks at 8:30 if the curfew's at 10?
You're mistaken and confusing the idea of a curfew when no one's allowed to be here to the idea of people being here and committing riotous behavior, doing something, failing to follow orders of police. Just because the curfew isn't in effect, if you're out on the street like people are now and we say, okay, enough, get off onto the sidewalk, that's a lawful order, and if you fail to follow it, then we have a right to move you once we give you notice. So I think you're just confusing the two items.
So your contention is that if people don't follow an order like get off the sidewalk, you can lawfully
This is a
tear
moving
gas
lane
them?
of traffic. There's cars driving through here. Somebody could get hurt. So we have the right to move you because it's a violation of law to be out here. Okay?
So your contention is that if people disobey an order, like move off the sidewalk or move out of the street, that tear gas is an appropriate tactic to use, or mace
Would you
or
rather
rubber
me
bullets?
put my hands on you, drag you off the street? Would that look better on your camera? I don't think it looks any better.
You're the chief of police. I'm not.
Right.
It's not about what looks good on my camera.
Yeah.
I'm asking you for your interpretation.
I'm saying it's
of
less
what your authority.
It's less problem to use something to to get people to disperse than if I come over here and I put my arms on you and I move you. I've taken control of you. That's a seizure. I would rather not seize you, because then I have to keep you. I'd rather just have you move on. It's a lot simpler.
So do you have authority to use whatever is necessary short of lethal force to move people if they disobey a lawful
No,
order like that?
that's a wrong. I wouldn't interpret that way. We know what those boundaries are. I don't mean to be rude about this, okay? But I'm gonna say it very simply. I've been doing this for 33 years. For me to explain to you all the nuances between when is when and what's too much too soon or too little too late, it would take too long to explain that. Okay. How about you trust us that we're doing things the best we can? We may get it wrong. We'll fix it. But trust us and work with us afterwards to say we didn't like the way this was done, and we'll work with you. Okay? Thank you.
So, last thing, do you think your officers have acted appropriately?
The community leader.
Okay, you're listening to WGRN 94.1, your community radio. Did you witness, quote, riotous behavior? Were they only moving in because of riotous behavior when you observed?
Certainly not. I've been at 3 separate protests in the last 5 days, and I've never observed anything that comes close to what could reasonably be described as riotous behavior. In fact, part of the reason that I wanted to ask him that question, the first question I asked him about why tear gas was being used at 8:30 when a curfew was 10, is because my understanding is that from the morning up until 8:30 p.m. at the State House grounds had been completely peaceful. that there had been, on that particular Sunday, no arrests, no violence of any kind, nothing that would come close to the description that the chief gave of a riotous act.
We're speaking with Jeremy Baiman, labor activist and Columbus resident who got an interview with the Columbus Chief of Police, Thomas Quinlan. Part of his thrust was, I've been doing this a long time, trust us. How do you respond to that?
If there were trust between the community and the police department here in Columbus, we wouldn't be seeing the kind of protests that we're seeing. Listen, this is not just about solidarity with George Floyd in Minneapolis. Certainly, obviously a momentous event, his murder at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. But there is a long history in Columbus of police violence, and in particular, police violence against our communities of color, against African-American men and women. Henry Green, Tyree King, the list goes on and on. So whatever trust the chief believes that the community should have in the police department has not been earned. It's that simple.
And again, I live right off the downtown, and when you're hearing what sound like flashbang grenades and hovering helicopters, and you're seeing National Guard armored vehicles, and they're closing off the entire downtown, and there's video showing the police look like they're corralling people and macing them or just walking up. This whole notion that you need to clear the sidewalks for the cars, I found a little disingenuous.
Absolutely. And it should be noted, while we're on the subject of the trust comment, that less than 4 hours later, after that interview, I went with the group that marched north into Short North. And again, the group stopped at an intersection. The march was starting to disperse. It was pretty late. It was after the curfew. And the police came in and began macing and tear gassing protesters again that same night. And this was the night that the Lantern journalists, the OSU student paper journalists, as well as the dispatch reporters, were maced despite identifying themselves as journalists who were exempt from the curfew. So even if you want to make the argument that you can enforce a curfew with tear gas and mace and stun grenades, which fragmentation grenades, whatever you want to call them, the journalists are exempt, and there's very clear video of them getting intentionally maced by the police despite identifying themselves. That was less than 4 hours after Quinlan said, "Just trust us."
So there's been a long history of people being maced by the police at the end of the rally. It sounds like you're suggesting there may be another agenda there. And you think it's being done to discourage a lawful protest?
Yeah, I mean, I was there. I got some mace. It wasn't too bad. I wasn't in the front, but there was nothing happening that would rise to the level of the need for chemical agents to be dispersed in the way that they were. In fact, the crowd was dissipating at that point, and folks were headed home. And we were at the intersection of Lane and High. And this was after the particularly violent night on Sunday. So, there is a pattern that seems to be emerging, just observationally, where during the day at the State House, the police will take a knee with protesters. The police will join the march. And then as soon as it gets dark, right, they come in with, their riot gear, with their mace, with their tear gas. And, we again, yesterday, we saw the police release a list of protesters that was so poorly redacted. And they did this, in the name of quote unquote transparency. It was pretty clear that it was purposely, left badly redacted so that any third grader with Google could figure out who was on the list. That Elizabeth Brown, the city council member, tweeted to please have them take it down immediately. And then Andrew Ginther, Mayor Ginther, retweeted that comment that they should also take down that list immediately, which to my knowledge, as of at least noon today, was still up. So, I mean, these folks, the police force seems to be acting with impunity. I don't really have a clear understanding as a resident of Columbus as to why the mayor and a city council member are tweeting about the police doing something out of line, asking them to take it down. You would think that the organization which sets the budget for the police and which also, signs the labor contract for the police would be able to pick up the phone and tell them to cut it out. But that does not seem to be the case. It's unclear who is in control of the police at this point.
Yeah, a few times. I've been maced a few times in Columbus, and ironically, I've only been maced at anti-police brutality rallies, and I've been maced as a journalist, and particularly I was maced twice after writing articles that were critical of the police. So it seems to be a long-standing policy. And not only that, to target activists. It came out, I had a client a few years ago, they had a list of people they wouldn't take complaints from, even if the complaints were legitimate. And the old axiom is, if you put police in riot gear, the police are going to riot.
That's right. I mean, that absolutely is confirmed by what I've witnessed, at least in the last week. I do remember the case of the list of activists coming out from whom they would not take complaints. And again, we just see this pattern over time, and it hasn't changed. A lot of folks are making comparisons to the State House protests on reopening the economy, right? Where men with semi-automatic rifles were storming the State House.
Neo-Nazis.
Yep. And the police stood idly by.
With military assault weapons.
Right.
And they were treated with the utmost courtesy.
Yeah, and I know we're running short on time, but I do also just want to point out the other conversation that is very interesting that occurred at the State House at the same time as I was there having a conversation with Quinlan, which I also got on camera and put on social media, was a conversation with another protester where Chief Quinlan was explaining why body cameras weren't in use. And I think it is almost more damning than the conversation that he had with me.
Body cameras. There's a limitation of body camera. It's $1,000 piece. Let me explain to you. It's a $1,000 piece of equipment. It has a battery. We're out here 24 hours a day, 5 days in a row. When do we recharge the battery? Well, let's say we had
the fucking battery.
Let's say we have 500 officers out here. And we
have a $600 million
12,
budget. What are you talking about? When do we recharge the battery?
One day.
With all the taxes they used to give it to all the corporations, we use some of that money to recharge the battery.
Go back and find who did what. So.
Chief Quinlan gives a litany of excuses. Just off the top of my head, from what I can recall, you guys are filming us, so we don't need to use body cameras. When do we recharge the batteries? That one was a whopper. They cost $1,000, keeping in mind that the public safety budget in Columbus is about $650 million.
Well, it seemed like they had several $1,000s of riot military equipment per police officer.
That's right.
Those people came down there, heavily armored and protected.
So there seems to be an excuse, for the tape covering the badges. There's an excuse for not using body armor. And frankly, as a Columbus resident, we deserve better and we deserve accountability.
And how does that come about?
Well, it starts at the top. I think it's pretty clear that Mayor Ginther is wholly unfit for this situation. And if he is incapable of reining in the police, then he has to step aside.
The question is how likely that is. Do you see a political movement with specific demands? Representative King was defeated, a well-known racist. Is that, can we in fact vote some people in that actually do believe that Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. Although I do want to be very careful. There is a tendency to try to pigeonhole these types of movements into electoral politics. And although that discussion I think is absolutely critical to have, it's, you know, certainly not my place to have it as someone who has not been a direct, you know, victim of police violence other than the occasional macing. You know,
you're not gonna
but I would
throw
encourage
anyone out without an actual movement, right? And the movement, and because it's a movement, really can't be dictated to or controlled. The movement will direct itself for the most part.
That's right. And again, I want to point folks to the concrete set of demands that the People's Justice Project has put out, that the community seems to be coalescing around. And for the moment, I would, you know, encourage the folks who are involved in this movement and allies like myself who want to stand in solidarity to take their lead and support these concrete reforms that are being proposed and fought for on the street.
And their key number one demand, establish an independent civilian review board, which, by the way, the NAACP negotiated for 4 years. The FOP agreed, and the first Black mayor of the city, Michael Coleman, stepped forward and said it wouldn't be adopted as an ordinance or put in the city charter. Yeah. So a little irony there. We're out of time. Any last thoughts?
Again, I just want to reiterate how powerful this movement is for Black lives and the incredible leadership that the young people of the city of Columbus are showing. You know, my small slice of you know, participation in this is absolutely nothing compared to the folks that have been fighting this battle for years and years with the Columbus Police Department. So I just think we all owe those folks a great debt of gratitude, and it is wonderful to see the city coming together to support that work. I hope it continues, and I hope it results in real, lasting, concrete change to the Columbus Police Department, because it is sorely needed.
Thank you, Jeremy Baiman. You're listening to WGRN 94.1. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob.
And hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord.